So I guess I've been introduced multiple times already. My name's Deborah Ball. I was a teacher in East Lansing Public Schools for many, many, many years. And eventually, once I had gone back to school and gotten my graduate degree, I taught at Michigan State for a while. And then now I teach at the University of Michigan. So there's lots of comments that get made about that. But I owe a lot to both these universities. I owe a lot to Michigan for hiring me, and I owe a lot to Michigan State for basically all my education. I got my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD at Michigan State. So I really do love both of them, but I do get a lot of teasing about this. And there's a lot of fighting in my family about it too. So how many people here went to Michigan State? How many people went to Michigan? Oh, good. Fair enough. What about other Michigan universities? So out of state, more people out of state? Oh, you want me to call out particular leaders? What about Western? Okay, Eastern? Wayne State? Where else? What am I missing? Yeah, so we could go through all of them now, right? Anybody go out of state to go to college? You went where? Online. You went online, okay. Well, anyway, great to see you all. I'm gonna, let's see how this works now. So I gave a very long title to this because they encouraged me to do that, but the essential thing is that I'm gonna talk about making teaching public. And I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about this phrase that's in the book, which is one of the principles, basically says there's value in making teaching public. So I wanted you to take a few minutes at your table and just, when you look at that sentence, what does the word public mean to you there? When I stood up and said we're gonna work on public teaching, what came to your mind? And then once you've talked about that briefly with a couple of people around you, what do you think the claim is that making it, whatever you mean by public, why is that value? Before we dive into even working on it, let's not take for granted that that statement is in the book. So just talk with a few other people around you. What do you think public means here? What comes to mind? And why do you think there's a claim here that it has value?
I think I learned more about math teaching from the English teacher that I went through National Board with.
Okay, take about half a minute more and then we'll come back together. All right, let's come back together. And Meg, where are you, Meg? Oh, there you are. Meg, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Meg.
Anything more you'd like to say?
I'm a math consultant at West Shore ESD and just thrilled to be here learning from Dr. Ball.
So Meg's going to help out a little. So even though we're a small group, I think so we can hear each other, she'll run the mic when we're talking. So what were some of the things that you talked about, either by what you mean by public or why you think a claim is being made that it has value?
So when I think about making our practice public or making teaching public, I think about how so often we work in isolation in our own buildings. I plan my lessons, I make my decisions around what I'm going to do with students instead of working more collectively with my colleagues and talking and planning together and reflecting on how it went, and even opening my classroom doors and saying, like, can we watch practice happen? We tell each other a lot about what's going on, but like to see the moves, to see the decisions, and even interact and say, like, well, why did you respond to that student in that way? Like, just really continues to be a learner of our practice.
Yeah, that's a great start. Thank you. What about other thoughts?
I'm Nick. I think that by making our practice public, it puts the attention on the practice and less on the evaluation of like an individual, right? So here's this thing we're trying to work on. I'll make myself vulnerable and I'll try it here, and let's all take a look at it so that we can build this together, right? Turning it into a collaborative rather than the individualized, here's how Nick did it.
That's very interesting what you just added. Why do you think, can I just ask you a question, or anybody can add on to this? Why do you think that it makes the focus more on the practice and less on the person?
I think, I don't know.
It's a good point. I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more.
I think it has to be intentional, right? But if we're making the work public, we're putting it out there, like, I don't know, in the ether for everybody to look at and critique. Yeah, I don't know.
I just think we should hang on to that, and maybe that will come back to that, because some of the things that make making one's teaching public hard is maybe not making that distinction. And so maybe making that distinction is an important part of
like
figuring
a mindset
out how to do
shift.
it.
Yeah.
And you wanted to comment, go ahead.
I can add on. I wonder if it goes back to how we define the word public. Because if public is just me displaying how I teach to others, then it is still about the person. But if by making it public, we mean how are we going to collaborate together to improve instruction for all kids, then it's less about the person and more about the practice.
Uh-huh. Were there any things that came up in your discussion that you kind of resisted the idea, like maybe it doesn't have so much value, or maybe there are problems with it? I mean, the questions lean you toward, like, why might it have value, and what is it? Did anyone talk at all about things that sort of make it hard to do or make you hesitant about it?
I'm Heather. I think for me, I'm reflecting as a building leader on how I've made teaching practices public in my building and how I need to think about doing that differently. I gave the example of videoing, a lesson and sharing that out. And I'm reflecting that I think I've done that more in a highlighting a practice, which then makes it more about the teacher in a way. Or I think it could be perceived that way for sure. And so thinking about that differently, and I interacted in a breakout where we really just reflected on what we saw, not as much as a model of what to do.
I think these are really, I think, important foundational comments for us to get started. Does anyone want to add anything else right now? So I thought I'd wait to say a little bit how I got into this in the first place. There's a picture of me in about my 5th year of teaching. Yes, really it is. That's my school picture. I got into this in a couple of different ways. Those are some images from the CSMP math curriculum that was used in Ann Arbor and East Lansing and some other districts in Michigan in the 1980s. And one way I got into this is that we had a model in my school district that started with the literacy teaching and went to be math, that teachers could rotate through a role called a helping teacher. And a helping teacher was someone who was released half the day and traveled around the district helping other people, and in this case, implement or use a new curriculum. I didn't know this curriculum any better than anyone else. I got some extra training, but the role evolved to be something where I would like meet with a colleague and they'd say, I absolutely don't understand what this lesson is asking or what it's about. Let's talk about it, and would you try it out with my kids? So I ended up in this role of sort of like what I ended up calling being like a pedagogical daredevil, like, okay, I'll try that. But it wasn't that I knew how to do it either. It was a way of collaboratively working on practice, but it gave me a taste of what that was like to be teaching with someone else watching me who wasn't my principal, which I was used to. But then around that same time, we had summer school, and I had this idea that I really wanted to think about how I was teaching fourth grade at the time, like what it would look like to have my students learning more about statistics. This is, I think, before more curriculum materials were actually developed for that. But I wanted to try something in the summer school setting, and the district was willing to have me do that. But then I thought, oh, it'd be cool to have a lot of other, or at least some other colleagues, like in the summer school setting, and we could think together about how we would organize this for the children. I'd be willing to teach it, but we could plan together, and then I would teach and we would talk about it. And that went really, really well. Like, we really liked that structure. And again, I felt like, well, we're really figuring something out. To your point, it's not so much like, does Deborah know how to do this, or Deborah's modeling it, to your point, but more, there are things that we all deal with that are hard, and there was value that I began to glimpse of being willing to do something where we were all thinking about it together. So that went back pretty far in my teaching career. And then later on in my teaching career, I began something that some of you may have already participated in called the Elementary Math Lab that occurs every single year now since 2007. And what happens is we have a summer school program for children, and I teach the summer school program. And we have educators from all over the country come and participate in it, kind of like, maybe like the surgical theater in the medical school, where a surgeon will be, sounds like a funny example to compare surgery to teaching, never mind that part of it, but someone will be doing a surgery and people will be watching from, like, some of you have maybe heard of that. And really the whole goal is to see how particular kinds of complex surgeries or even routine ones get carried out. Certainly this is not like that, but the idea of having that many people watching still picked up on what I think you raised, which is there are endemic problems that we all tackle, and it's very different to talk about them or to read about them or to share like even artifacts from our teaching than is to watch it happening live. And I think that was your point too. Like, what does the tone sound like? Like, what's happening? What are all the things that actually remain really invisible when we only talk to each other? Because so much about teaching isn't it, like, it sort of is visible and isn't visible, both. For example, one thing I think people end up talking a lot about is like how we use space in the classroom. Like when you're crouching by a student and trying to be eye level, or when you're like standing at the back of the room instead of the side. And all of that is part of our work and we all do it. But when we share a lesson, we don't necessarily talk about any of those things. And there were many things like that, including, of course, who gets called to the board and how that gets handled. So many things became much more able to be worked on. So that's fine, but it doesn't really work that easily. And so what this session is about is what I've been learning that I wanted to sort of engage us in thinking together about. It's almost like a meta level of the whole thing. Like, how do I make public the practice of public teaching, and engage you in thinking with me, like, what is that practice of learning to do that? And how might more of us do that in different ways? Like you said, you already do that in some ways. How can I keep learning? What are things to do to make that possible? And what might other people do? So that's kind of the basis for this session. So these are the 5 things I thought we'd do, and not all the same like amount of time. I wanted to make a few comments about why this is so, I would call it almost countercultural in our profession. Like you said, it's such a private, independent kind of work. In fact, many people like that about teaching. I like the fact that I can close my door and nobody's, except when my principal comes in, you know, it's up to me. And people will say that they love teaching because they can do what they can do things that matter to them. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And then I'm going to try to say a little more about what's involved in public teaching. And I'm going to take us through a few rounds of that, actually trying a little bit of it here by watching some video, which is still not quite the same thing as live teaching, but it's a version of it. And then thinking about what's the work when you're doing the teaching and people are watching it. And then one more round of like what actually else is involved in doing it. Because one of the things that I think is important to highlight is it's rather different than just saying, well, I'm not really very afraid to have people watch me. I'm willing to be vulnerable. Sure, come by. What I've been finding is that there are some interesting aspects of what else you have to be doing in order to make that valuable for other people. And so I thought we could surface some of those. And again, it's not like I have this all figured out. I was hoping to interest enough people in it, since I've kind of been doing it for a long time, and see what ideas you have and what you've tried as well. And maybe together we have a kind of collective sense, both about what it can be done to make it maximally useful for the profession and for one another. So that's kind of the goal. Does that seem okay? Okay. All right, so I'm arguing a little bit just at the beginning that we've inherited a profession that's unusually private. Lots of other professions are not as private as teaching is. Certainly they are in some ways, but if whenever you go probably to a medical appointment, you'll see that there are sometimes, depending on where you are, there may be medical students, or there may be, people who have other roles in medical care who are in the room or with you. And many times that's true. And many other kinds of occupations are not that private, and it's quite routine to see one another's practice. Teaching has definitely become, over time, or maybe retained this kind of aspect of being very private and individual. So most teaching occurs behind closed doors. I mean, how many of you have done team teaching? Yeah, some of you have done that. I did that also, and probably that may have whetted my appetite for that was a useful thing to be doing, is teaching with another person. Even now at the university, I sometimes get to do that, and I always find that I learn a lot. That's still not public teaching, but it's at least not completely isolated. Many people say, probably most of you might say, that they learned most of what they learned about how to teach on the job. And so they value a lot the experience that they have in their classrooms and think about it as something they've learned to do. People will often say, well, that's very interesting. You may even find yourself saying that today, like watching a video and then saying, well, that's interesting what Deborah did there, but that's not really my style. So the idea that we have styles and we sort of pick things that are a preference is a little unusual. It isn't that it's bad, it's just not typical. Physicians don't say, well, I noticed that you use this particular style of bandaging, but that's not my style. I use this other way of bandaging. That wouldn't be very typical, and we probably wouldn't like it if medical practitioners were doing that, or if other kinds of, if the person who repaired our car did that. We probably would appreciate that. They think there are things to learn that can be done more commonly. So that's the style of our method. And we don't have very good norms for discussing practice. So I think one of the things I have to help teacher candidates learn when we look at video or when we observe a class is to not make every comment start with, I liked when they blank, or I didn't like blank. Like, that's a very sort of narrow or impoverished kind of comment. So like, what's the repertoire of like moves or sentence stems that we use to talk about teaching? And I'm still really thinking, I wanted to think with you about this point about, is it the teacher or the teaching? Because teaching is personal, right? So there will be things that we see when we watch one another teach that are about the person doing it. It matters their racial identity, it matters their gender identity, it matters all kinds of things. Like, I teach now with a very tall Black man who's younger than I am, and even just like being in the space and for him to get down to talk to our first graders eye to eye is like really physically demanding for him, and for me it's really easy. So even the size of a person matters for the work, but certainly all kinds of other things that are legitimately are about the person. However, there are also things about the work that we tend to overthink are the person when they're actually part of the work. And so I think that probably leads to making it hard to talk about. Maybe if we considered something like what authors do. Authors share their texts and get critique on them, and certainly the author is involved with their text, but there is a norm of how you talk about text if you have it in a group. And that's, I think, part of what the field will need to cultivate, to have public teaching be something that we actually embrace, would be to have more practices about what we do when we're actually seeing public teaching, not just when we're doing it. So we'll have a little chance to see how we do that together today. There are a few counterexamples to my claim that everything's very private. So it's become a little bit more common for teacher candidates to rehearse a lesson or a practice before they try it out of their field placement. That's become more common. Lesson study, which a lot of us learned about, was a very common professional learning structure in Japan, became something, and still is in many parts of the US, something that goes on in districts where teachers co-plan a lesson, they work on it for a long time together, refining the lesson, people try it out in their classrooms, they refine it. It's a very carefully curated way of working on a lesson, and it's called lesson study, but it is public because teachers take turns trying out that lesson in front of other people. I think we've probably for a long time had demonstration teaching or model teaching, and I appreciated your comment that this could be different than that, which is the difference between saying, I'm going to show you an exemplary practice, and saying, we're just going to watch teaching and all the things that happen to all of us all the time that are not ideal, but we have to manage, is different than modeling. But modeling and demonstration teaching has had its place and is a thing, but this, what we're talking about here, is maybe a little different from that. And then video clubs and public teaching days are somewhat newer practices. I know that in Grand Rapids Public Schools over the last several years, many of the elementary teachers have engaged together with some of us in doing video clubs where they video recorded themselves and gotten together and talked about video records from their teaching. That's also a form of public teaching. Or public teaching days is another thing where in a building there's a day when you see a few different people teaching a lesson. So there are some counterexamples, and generally the goal is just to make teaching more available for shared study and shared development of things. So if there are things that are hard to do, by having public teaching, we all get to work on, like, here's a way to maybe handle that kind of thing that comes up so often, or here's the way to launch a discussion that seems to go better with kindergartners, or whatever it is. But there are some consequences for this very private kind of inheritance. So we have, one is that teaching's pretty idiosyncratic, and lots of people have written about this, that people really many of us have learned the most of what we actually routinely do from our own, what somebody calls the apprenticeship of observation, which refers to our own experience as kids in school. We're probably all still doing things that we remember, that we aren't even realizing we're doing, but that have just become normal because we grew up seeing teachers doing those things. How we respond when we say good job, or we ask if somebody wants to help out someone so-and-so. Probably we didn't learn that in our teacher ed programs or in professional learning. We're doing that because we've seen it happen so much. And that means that teaching's, we're partly repeating things we've all seen without quite realizing it, and teaching's pretty individual. On the equity front, it also means that because teaching has been historically quite inequitable, that we're repeating things that have created patterns of inequity without actually realizing it. And so the fact that we learn so much from our apprenticeship of observation and just on our own means that practices that are inequitable don't get disrupted very easily, because we're not always aware that we're doing things. They're kind of normal, the way we handle things, like having a student, moved out of the room when they're not participating well. There's some reasons to think that that's problematic, but it's normal. We're used to seeing it. We're used to seeing if a child is disruptive, that a child might get removed. But the idea that we'd work on what are alternatives to that might take more collective work. That also means there's been less collective professional knowledge than there should be. Macy said earlier in their session, they were talking about research. It really baffles me a little bit that we've gotten into a space where things are supposed to be research-based, when in fact, if you thought about it, the collective wisdom of many teachers who have taught for a long time is a very legitimate source of knowledge, but we don't have a very good way of organizing, claiming that knowledge, or curating it, partly because we don't work collectively as much as we ought to. And there are consequences in a variety of ways about why collective professional knowledge has sort of been given over to the claim of research base, which is a whole conversation in its own right, but it is a cost for us. It doesn't help us improve instruction very much when we're working on our own this much. And it sort of publicly, I would say now public like the country, does make it seem like anybody could teach. Like if everybody just learns it on the job and it's just adults working with children, and many people now aren't really particularly prepared to do teaching, even if we weren't prepared as well as we'd like, many of us did have some teacher preparation, but it's making a lot of people, both policymakers and the public, think that teaching's not really very difficult and anyone can do it. And we don't help ourselves when we make it sound like, oh, well, I just learned it by doing it. It sounds like, well, anybody who's willing to do it then could learn it. So we're not doing ourselves a lot of good by not emphasizing the nature of professional work, and in particular, the collective work we could be doing together. So moving on, that's just kind of like, I think some sort of historical and social reasons why I think this is important and not just a nice thing. So now I want to go through some rounds of like what's involved in doing public teaching. So the first viewing of a video that I'm going to use today, I'm going to use it a few times, is we're just going to kind of simulate public teaching as though it were live in my classroom. And I am deliberately using video from my own classroom because part of the point here is to say, like, what's involved in actually using your teaching as an artifact with other teachers. So it wouldn't have made much sense for me to be showing a video of somebody else, because part of what I'm trying to engage us in thinking about is like, what is it? So this will try to simulate that the best we can. So one thing that I think is pretty important is that before you watch somebody else's teaching, you have to kind of know what their kids are going to be working on and have thought about it, because otherwise it's really hard to see what's going on or why what kinds of things are happening. So we'll do that right now. So this is the math problem that the children in the video will have been working on, and we're just going to see a little bit, like 5 minutes at most, maybe less, of the beginning of a class discussion about this problem. So basically, it's a class of about 30 students. You would know that if you were there. The majority of them are Black children. There are, I think, just a couple of white children, a couple of Latinx children. All the children do speak English as their first language and their home language. And they've been working for a while on fractions. So this is the kind of thing I would say if you came to the classroom. I would explain what we'd already been working on. We've been working on area models, and this problem was designed kind of on purpose to like push a lot on the notion of equal parts and the notion of areas as being need to be partitioned equally. So I think for you to think about this for a minute, first of all, the problem for you won't be difficult mathematically, but just try to do the problem with a neighbor, but mostly think about what do you think that children who are just learning about area models and the role of the whole and of equal parts might actually come up with for this problem. So the problem is this diagram, and then the wording is what fraction of the big rectangle is shaded blue, what fraction is shaded green, and what fraction of the big rectangle is shaded altogether. So I'll give you about a minute to just think through the problem yourself, think about what kids might say, think what you think the point is, and then we'll move on from there. So what kind of, what are you curious about this problem? What do you think students might do? What do you think the point is?
So I think some of the consideration will be around how the whole thing is partitioned differently. Mm-hmm. You know, we have triangles and we have rectangles, and you know, visually how they will attune to those, and thinking about fractional parts.
Do you have thoughts about what answers might come up? Like for the first question, what fraction is shaded blue? What do you think kids might say?
I'm gonna guess somebody's gonna say 1/6.
Say what in 6?
1/6.
And why?
Because there's 6 parts and one of them is shaded.
Any other possibilities?
They might say half because they might only just see the smaller rectangle as what they need to focus on instead of the whole, the bigger rectangle.
Because there's something about the wording of the problem that makes that's usefully ambiguous or problematically ambiguous. So what fraction of the big rectangle? Are you curious about the wording?
I'm just wondering if you are considering a square or rectangle, or is it only a stripe down or a stripe across?
So in other words, like say a little bit more.
So I'm just wondering, is a rectangle, are you considering a rectangle just the two squares down or the two squares across, or is the entire shape a rectangle, even though we know it's a specific rectangle called a square?
So that ambiguity is, I think, what we may want to watch. And this kind of discussion before watching a lesson is part of the public teaching, like engaging us all and thinking like, you know, the wording of problems are consequential. And sometimes we on purpose make a problem a little bit ambiguous to surface things, but sometimes we don't realize that we've made something ambiguous and we didn't mean for it to be. So maybe that's something to think about as we watch the problem unfold. Anything else you want to be watching for? Okay, so let's keep going. So sometimes in public teaching, it's useful to share a little bit about what the teacher's working on. So what I might tell you some things that I don't call them struggling with, but they're issues for me that I'm working on. So one of the things I'm working on is, it's fairly early in my work with these kids, and so I'm still working on how to involve a range of students in sharing their thinking when we have a group discussion. That's one thing I'm working on. I'm working on trying to position kids in the class as competent, particularly ones that I'm beginning to get a sense other kids might not think they are, or that I know there are patterns that particular identities tend to not be seen, either as being seen as competent or assumed to be or not. So I'm working on like learning the kids and thinking about how I can do that better. I'm trying to develop some norms of collective work because they don't seem to be all that used to it yet. And like both what it is to share your work, but also what kind of comments might you expect the teacher to make if you've shared your work. What should you say to a classmate when they share their work? So I'm trying to develop that. I'm trying to respond to kids' thinking as I'm just, I've only been working with them for a little bit of time. And of course, the mathematical point is I'm trying to develop their understanding of the whole and of the importance of equal parts. Because like to the notion of the answer 1/6, I mean, that does make sense. If this were discrete pieces, you could say 1/6, right? If they were just cookies and they weren't a rectangle and it wasn't an area model, you could say 1/6 of the cookies are green. It's only because it's an area model that matters. So if a student says 1/6, that's actually sensible. But this problem is designed to help them think you have to say what the whole is, and that once you say that, you have to have the part. You at least either have to imagine the equal parts, or you have to make equal parts. So
I'd like to see some hands from people I haven't seen speaking in whole group yet.
Okay, so we're going to watch the video. It's very short. Consider what I said I'm trying to work on to see what thoughts you have and anything else that occurs to you.
I'd like to see some hands from people I haven't seen speaking in whole group yet today. Who thinks that they could explain their thinking for question 1? Still waiting to see a few more hands. Lots of people have work done in their notebooks. Okay, Mamadou, what do you think about question 1?
Question 1, I say it's 1/2.
Okay, can you explain how you came up with 1/2?
Because they both equal. They both equal, and one half of it is shaded in, and the other half is not.
Okay, can you come up to the board and point and show us what you're looking at? Just there's a diagram right there. Can you come up and show? Did everyone hear what Mamadou said? You should be thinking already about his reason. Who can repeat what Mamadou said? Okay, well, if you're listening carefully, you should always be able to tell what someone just said. Devon, what did he say?
He said he's looking at the school rectangle, and he's saying it's 1/2 of the rectangle. Not just he's not looking at the whole. He just
Wait. Let him talk. Don't go on to explain it yet. Okay, Mamadou, go ahead. You're gonna use the big one.
half of it.
Just a second. Everyone should be looking up at where Mamadou's pointing. Otherwise, you won't understand his explanation. Sean, this way. Look up there. Okay.
They both equal, and half of it is shaded in, so that makes it 1.
Okay. So up in the slide, I have the things I said I was trying to work on. And what I'd like you to talk about at your tables for a few minutes, then we'll come back together. What are your thoughts about any of the focal issues that like are an issue in this practice? And are there other things that your observation surfaces that you'd like to bring up for us to talk about? So we're simulating kind of a little bit of a debriefing after watching something. All right, let's come back together. And really, the floor is pretty open. A little bit later today, we'll talk a little bit more about the debriefing phase of public teaching, but right now I'm just letting it be pretty unstructured. The only structure that I've offered is just like to share a little bit about things that I'm like kind of struggling with or trying to work on that I'd be interested in other people, not so much judging them, but like contributing to thinking about those things. But there may be other things as well, and part of public teaching would be to create the space for other issues to arise that because we profit from things different people would see. So again, we're avoiding like liking, not liking certain things, but we're just thinking together about practice. So anything is fair game. Who'd like to start?
I think the instructor did a nice job of saying explicitly that she was looking for more voices than she had previously heard in the conversation and waiting for more students to raise their hand. However, I was wondering, some students that haven't participated, why might they not be participating? Might they feel anxious? Might they not want to come to the board if they know that's what's expected of them? Maybe thinking around some of those moves. How could you help support students that are feeling
Did
anxious?
something come to mind as like a move to try at that?
We were thinking like a turn and talk before you ask someone to come and share, so they could at least like rough
So
draft their
they
thinking.
had worked like with a partner already before we got to this point. But that's, I think you're raising an important point. Are there other things like, so this is the launch of the group discussion. So this, I think you're raising something important. Are there other things that might have, like, since they're just learning that this is part of the normal practice here, are there other things? Yeah, you have a thought? Thank you for bringing that up.
I just think to add on, I forgot what you were saying to her at the end, but like we could position the kids to think of active learners like, okay, how is, he's up at the board, how is his problem or answer similar, different to yours, and how would you tweak or change it? That way they're kind of actively like, and not just seeing his presentation and just going, oh, he's presenting it this way, but they're thinking about theirs in comparison to his. So they're kind of more active in it versus just going, well, I got this and he got that. So they're kind of, that maybe they wouldn't check out as much.
Yeah, your comment makes me sorry that we cut off a little bit soon.
Okay.
No, because it's so important. That's you've noticed something that I think a lot about too, is like what happens after someone shares. And one of the issues I was working on is like, what should they expect the teacher's going to do and what should they do? And what I learned really early that I was working on here is that kids would jump to agreeing and disagreeing or sharing their thinking. And so we started to work on having a norm that we aren't getting to see, unfortunately, which was you don't get to agree or disagree as your first move. All you can do is ask a question of Mamadou or comment. And then we had to learn what a comment was, but we didn't get to see that. But I think you're pointing to an issue we all face, which is they don't actually listen because they start to think what they want to say. And it takes some, like some work that we have to do is to figure out how we get them to actually talk to each other about each other's thinking before they just disagree. And I had to learn that the hard way because in an earlier year, they would just launch into, and they wouldn't just say they disagreed with an answer. They'd say like, I disagree with Meg. And we had to learn like, you're not disagreeing with Meg, you're disagreeing with Meg's answer, but you're not, it's not about a personal thing. But in here we were trying to figure out like, how do you slow that process down so that they actually are listening to what someone else said and learning from it. So I'm glad you raised that. Were there other things? Any thoughts about the problem so far from what you've seen? Because we talked about that before the lesson. So anything occur to you about the wording of the problem or the problem itself?
Well, I think we've seen that the 1/2 came up and the student stopped himself from saying square and went back to rectangle because of the way that the problem was posed. That's what I noticed.
Are there thoughts anybody has about the wording? Like, is the way it wording, does it seem like it should be worded differently to you? Does it seem like it's doing useful work worded the way it is from what you've seen so far?
I'll share an idea. I think the wording's okay because I think it's going to help lift that idea of what is the whole and what are the units within that whole.
So that kind of discussion of the problem, not just the children, is another thing that public teaching, because we see the problem in motion, not just like looking at a lesson plan or looking at a curriculum material. So this is a little bit staged because we're not watching a whole class, but it's because I want to just surface some different things. So one feature so far is sharing what you're working on, naming things that might be, I don't know if struggling is the right word, but something that one is working on with this particular class or in one's own teaching, making sure that people understand what the work is that's laid out, not defending it, but just explaining it, and then having some kind of debrief afterwards. I talked a lot more in this debrief than normally, but normally we found that it's actually quite helpful for whoever's doing it to not talk very much right away afterwards, but to maybe make a couple of comments about what you noticed and then to kind of step away and let the group talk is actually quite useful. Here, I think I found myself leaning into it a little bit because we showed such a short piece, but keep in mind that there's value in not necessarily setting it up to be a Q&A with the teacher isn't necessarily the most useful way for it to work. So we want to do a second viewing now where we're going to be a little bit more meta about the work of public teaching. And here I want to surface two features of it that I think are important to keep in mind. This is where it begins to show, like maybe highlight that public teaching isn't just teaching and having people be in your room. So there are two groups of people that effectively you're kind of teaching, if maybe teaching isn't quite the right word, but you're teaching the children, they still have to be the center point, right? They're your students. But you're also at least facilitating the learning of other people. And so if you don't think about that, it can make it very hard for it to be useful for other people. So we're gonna try to look at those two purposes to see how they coincide or don't, and if you can see evidence of those in watching the video. So
I'd like to see some hands from people I have.
we're going to watch it again, and I want you to think if you can notice things that seem like they're things that get said or done that seem like they're explicitly for the kids, and things that get said or done that might be explicitly for observers, or both.
I'd like to see some hands from people I haven't seen speaking in whole group yet today. Who thinks that they could explain their thinking for question 1? Still waiting to see a few more hands. Lots of people have work done in their notebooks. Okay, Mamadou, what do you think about question 1?
Question 1, I say it's 1/2
Okay, can you explain how you came up with 1/2?
because they both equal. They both equal, and one half of it is shaded in, and the other half is not.
Okay,
So
can you
that
come up
makes
to the
you-
board and point and show us what you're looking at? Just, there's a diagram right there. Can you come up and show? Did everyone hear what Mamadou said? You should be thinking already about his reason. Who can repeat what Mamadou said? Okay, well, if you're listening carefully, you should always be able to tell what someone just said. Devon, what did he say?
He said he's looking at the school rectangle and he's saying it's one half of the rectangle. Not just he not looking at the whole. He just
Wait, let him talk. Don't go on to explain it yet. Okay, Mamadou, go ahead. You're gonna use the big one?
half of it.
Just a second, everyone should be looking up at where Mamadou's pointing. Otherwise, you won't understand his explanation. Sean, this way. Look up there, okay?
They both equal and half of it is shaded in, so that makes it one.
Okay, so the question was, what can you notice specifically that you think is really directed at the children? Do you think there are things you're hearing that are directed about supporting colleagues? And do you think any of those are both? So what I'm thinking about is, do you notice particular things that got said or done, or where the teacher is, or anything else that might contribute to those two purposes? So take a couple minutes at your table and then we'll come back.
More of the time, like definitely more where she was telling my kids kind of reminding.
I don't know, I'm just guessing.
But again, it's
That
she's
felt
also
intentional
modeling
to
the kinds of norms that you could be using
Of the observant persons, yes.
So
The student, or the children. Or maybe, I'm sorry, it could be both. So, like, if they, knowing that other people also have stuff, or she's saying, like, I know you have something in your notebook, I'm inviting you to
child, and that was just a reminder to that child, like starting to do this. But that's also teaching you that you can do too.
All right, let's come back together. Are there some things that you notice that you would say serve one or both of those purposes explicitly? I feel like the teacher on the video. Lots of people were talking at their tables.
So we were talking about the first thing that you said when you said, I would like to see hands from people I haven't heard from today. And we said that was definitely for the observers, because it was the exact statement that you said, this is something I'm working on. We kind of went back and forth as to whether it could have been for the kids or not. But you actually talked to the kids later about that. So they probably didn't even need to hear that initially.
So you interpreted that as being certainly in service of the observers to know.
Primarily.
And for them to know what were you thinking that shows the observers?
I think it showed them what you were working on in that lesson.
Were there other examples of things that you thought served one or another purpose? I'll share some of mine, okay? So one focus of public teaching is teaching the kids, right? I think no matter what the format is, if you're doing public teaching days or it's a summer school lab like we have, it's still the centerpiece has to be for the kids. And how do you make sure that it's also useful professionally? So I just picked a few comments from the video that I think we were talking about. So the first one is the one you just talked about, I think. Still waiting to see a few more hands. Lots of people have worked on in their notebooks. So this slide is just about how these different statements that we saw are about the kids. And then we're going to look at them again to see what they might be doing for the observers. So when teaching the children, that first statement is trying to elicit more student thinking, trying to broaden distribute turns. So some people have their hands up, but they're the same people who have had their hands up before. So by saying that, the teacher is trying to signal, at least making an effort to signal that that the teacher has seen that people have work done and is wanting to hear from some different people. The second thing is you should be thinking already about his reason. Who can repeat what Mamadou said? If you're listening carefully, you should always be able to tell what someone just said. Delvon, what did he say? Is being explicit with the children about that listening is actually about listening to your classmates, and that it's an important practice and they're expected to engage in it. They're expected to be able to answer the question, what did so-and-so just say? So that's an explicit, like, teaching to them what is listening. Listening's not about behaving well or being polite. It's actually about being able to see, I think some of you were talking about this, be able to hear what your classmates said. Third one is, can you put your finger around the part you're calling the whole? Do you see where he just pointed and where are the equal parts? Is supporting the practice of explaining. So helping students know when you go to the board, like, you need to show whatever the thing is you're explaining, there are ways to show your classmates what you're talking about, which is also about going to the board in the first place, not just talking from your seat, but learning what an explanation in math might have to include. And the last one was, raise your hand if you understand what Mamadou did. Who knows what Mamadou did to get his answer of 1/2? I guess this part we didn't see, so this goes into what you asked. I don't want to hear how you agree or disagree. I just want you to tell me, what did he do? And so that's being explicit that the work is to pay attention to and try to understand someone else's thinking, not yet. This goes exactly to what we were talking about. And I cut off that piece of the video. That your job is to first just hear and see if you can explain someone else's thinking, not whether you agree or disagree with it, not if it's the same as yours at all. So all of that is explicitness to the children. What's interesting is if we repeat those same statements, we may be able to also see things that they're doing, not just for other teachers to see, but maybe things that are explicitly with them as the colleagues as the audience. So let's try that. So the second focus is, like, being conscious that you have colleagues that are working with you and thinking together with you about your practice. So the same statements again, and making teaching what I would call studyable. Like, what makes it possible for other people to learn from one another's practice? So the first statement about waiting to see more hands, that actually signals to other people maybe that that kids do have work done. Like, they can't see that. If someone's watching your teaching, they can't see things you've just seen as like what written work kids have, because you may decide that you want people to walk around when the kids are working, but that is a decision to have people in and among the kids when they're working. In this case, the observers aren't able to do that. And so saying something that helps them know, like, hey, a whole bunch of the kids have answers in their notebooks, that it's available. The second one was, you should be already thinking about his answer, could be signaling what students are expected to be doing when a classmate goes to the board. It's not just dead time, because for many of us, that's a problem when kids go to the board and they start to write something and then, like, what's everybody else supposed to be doing? So here you can see that the expectation is that students are supposed to already be thinking about what he's doing and what you're thinking about it. And that may signal to colleagues that that's the purpose. Having Mamadou trace and all of that on the board helps the observers to know Mamadou's thinking. So it's not just that the kids can learn it, but it also makes more explicit to the observers, like, what is Mamadou thinking about? And the last one was, raise your hand if you understand what he did. That's helping observers see how many students think they understand what Mamadou did and what is being asked of them. So they are the same statements, but one of the things over time that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm curious what you think, is that if one is conscious of what one is being explicit with the kids about, quite often those same things are useful to observers. But there are statements that don't work both ways. And so part of what makes this kind of metacognitively demanding is that one has to kind of think about both groups, if you will. Your primary goal is the kids, but if you don't think about the fact that you have colleagues watching, they can feel pretty shut out of, like, what's going on here. And so comments that make that more transparent are helpful. And it is something to learn. It's not like it comes naturally to be thinking about that, because when we're teaching, we're pretty absorbed. And so I think it's worth surfacing that that's kind of a skill to develop if one wants to be doing more public teaching. Okay, so the last piece of this is that even with what we've already said, there are 3 kinds of work. that go into helping to make public teaching helpful to everybody. And there are three things that I wanted to talk about. One is finding ways to support other people's observing, because they're not you. They're not walking around your room. Again, you might decide to do that, but even if they are, they're not you. They don't know the kids as well. They don't know what's in your head. There's so much stuff that we all think about that's tacit that isn't available. So when some people are only watching what we're doing, it's not really completely making our practice public. So some of this is about like, what does it take to actually make the work we do public or visible, if that makes sense. So I'll say a little bit about things that seem to help with that. A second is just making the teaching and learning itself visible, like what is there to see that might not be normal to be paying attention to. And this is more probably for the children, but finding a way to minimize the publicness of it. And the only way I found to describe that is sort of feeling like you're making a little bit of a cocoon in which you and the children are in. You may have a better metaphor for that, but there are ways to help the children think like there are people watching today, but we're actually not paying any attention to them. They're here because they're really interested in the kind of work that you do and the thinking that you do. So in some ways conveying to them the seriousness of it, but that they don't need to worry about the people. And sometimes it's even helpful to say, if it bothers you that someone's watching, be sure you tell me privately. But the observers also have to be respectful of the kids are being really generous by letting somebody into the room while they're thinking. And so sometimes we'll say a little bit more about this, that finding a way to create that safer space for the children matters for them. Okay, so we're going to watch it one more time, and then we're going to try to watch those three things, like what's happening to make it more studyable, what's happening to make it visible, and what does the cocoon look like.
I'd like to see some hands from people I haven't seen speaking in whole group yet today. Who thinks that they could explain their thinking for question one? Still waiting to see a few more hands. Lots of people have work done in their notebooks. Okay, Mamadou, what do you think about question one?
Question one, I say it's 1/2.
Okay, can you explain how you came up with 1/2?
Because they both equal. They both equal, and one half of it is shaded in, and the other half is not.
Okay,
so
can
that
you come up
makes
to the
it-
board and point and show us what you're looking at? Just, there's a diagram right there. Can you come up and show? Did everyone hear what Mamadou said? You should be thinking already about his reason. Who can repeat what Mamadou said? Okay, well, if you're listening carefully, you should always be able to tell what someone just said. Devon, what did he say?
He said he's looking at the school rectangle, and he's saying it's 1/2 of the rectangle. Not just he not looking at the whole. He just
Wait, let him talk. Don't go on to explain it yet. Okay, Mamadou, go ahead. You're gonna use the big one?
half of it.
Just a second, everyone should be looking up at where Mamadou's pointing. Otherwise you won't understand his explanation. Sean, this way. Look up there, okay?
They both equal, and half of it is shaded in, so that makes it 1.
Okay, so a few things to see. In terms of supporting observing, one thing we did that does really seem to matter is having people do whatever, if it's not math, then something else, but having the people like actually do whatever it is the kids are going to be doing. Thinking about where your body is in the space, you can make it very obstructive for people to see. And so that's also something we're not used to thinking about. We're just thinking about the kids, but being a little bit more aware of like where you're standing and where you're moving does matter for this. Another is like getting everybody in the room to talk louder without making a big point that the kids are talking for the observers. So it is helpful for the kids to learn to project when they talk in class. I've had classes where they talk so quietly like nobody can hear anything anybody is saying. So we try to practice from the very beginning talking so other people can hear and creating a norm that they can say to each other, can you repeat that? I didn't hear you. But that actually helps the observers, because if they can't hear the kids, the whole thing is sort of not useful, because teaching is so much about how we elicit from children and how we respond. And so figuring out a way to get the kids to talk loudly enough matters a lot, but it serves your purposes anyway. And finally is making artifacts that are big enough for everyone to see. If everything's like very small, then people are gonna have a lot of trouble. But again, that does help the children too, but it's a little bit of extra work. sometimes to make posters or charts that you might otherwise think, well, we can live without that. So on a day that you're having public teaching, you may want to think a little bit about like what's available to be seen. Or if you use like a smart board or a document projector, thinking about that a little bit in advance about what makes it possible to see. Because as it is, they can't usually see the children's written work. If they're writing in a notebook or on a worksheet, they probably won't be able to see that till later. This other part, I think, I'll be curious to see what you think, but making teaching and learning visible, one problem is how much, like I said a couple of times, is so much in our heads, our reasons for calling on certain kids, our purposes, our goals for that day. Like, is my goal to finish this problem and nail the idea of the whole, or am I opening something up? Are there particular children I really wanted to get to the board that day? All of that is like in our head, and to make teaching more studyable, we actually have to know what each other is like designing into the lesson so that as we watch, we can see what's happening. And so this probably is something that you will have reactions to, but I have found that it's useful to create some lesson plans that are specific for a day of public teaching that give more explicitness around some of the thinking that went into things. So I'll show you later where I've stored some examples for you to see, but I made a slide to just show a little bit. You won't be able to tell. That's a page just of the purposes of this particular day we've been watching. Normally, I would never write that down for myself, but on a day that people are going to be watching, this includes a lot of things about particular kids or about where the class is in terms of developing norms that make that more apparent for an observer to see and then be able to talk about. And again, it's not modeling like the right practice. It's more making more visible the kind of thinking we all do, but remains like not visible to others. And the lesson plan itself is a column format that kind of borrows from the Japanese lesson study format, where there's like a time block on the left, and then the learning goals, then the actual lesson plan, and then like the last column is like comments of things to be concerned about or that I'm wanting to pay attention to. I would never write any of this down for myself, probably not even in my first year of teaching. So it's kind of onerous to do, but it does really help to generate better collective discussion because more stuff is available. Like this would have an explanation of why that problem and what it is I'm thinking about, but that would make it possible for people to critique the problem because they could see like how it was designed, as opposed to just wondering and having a Q&A. So that's something to consider because it is a lot more work for the public teacher to do, the person doing it, but it does enhance what's available to be learned because so much of teaching isn't visible. Whoops. And the other thing we've sort of been talking about already is that making it more visible is to do more narrating explicitly both to the children and to the observers. You're never really talking directly to the observers. Like you could. I haven't found that to be something I do, but that is something you could consider is would you pause in the middle of teaching and say, by the way, what I'm doing right now is X or Y? You could do that. But the idea of the cocoon is not, in some ways, for me at least, to be interrupting the actual teaching with commentary to the observers. So that's a decision for you. But given that I'm not stopping to make comments to everybody as I'm teaching, the more that I can say to the kids, like right now I expect you to be hearing what Mamadou is saying, is sort of telling everybody like that's what the kids are supposed to be doing right now. So that's something to consider is how are you like communicating with the observers, and do you want to be doing that while you're doing public teaching? And the final thing is this publicness for the children. So I talked about the cocoon. I think it seems like it's possible to do this by focusing even more than usual on really being intentionally, really watching the children, really listening to them, really talking to them. It helps you also to forget about who's there. Because sometimes there have been as many, at the elementary math lab, there's sometimes as many as like 100 people watching a class in a very big space. And so learning how to like just forget that there are people there has been useful. And I really promise you that you can do that, but it takes some thought to realize like just forget about the fact that there are people there. We're all teachers. They're not there to evaluate you. We're trying to study practice. So you probably won't ever have that many, but you might have 30 people. And it takes some thought to just like, the kids and I are doing our thing right now, and we're not going to pay attention to anyone else. And that comes about by the more we focus on the kids, the easier it is to just forget about adults being there. I think creating some norms of talk in the way that the kids and I talk to each other also helps with that. And then really deliberately not watching the observers, like learning not to see them which sounds really weird, but it is really possible to do. That even if they've got like 12 people sitting in the back of your room, just learn not to see them. And you can do that, but you have to realize that that's a thing to be learning, and that will help not feel self-conscious about it. And just to realize what you're doing is making your teaching available so that everybody, we can all like think together about the challenges we face as teachers. So I'll wrap up right now and then have some chance for you to sort of critique and think about where we could go with all of this. So one question I think is worth thinking about is, how does doing public teaching affect, how is it for the kids? Like, are we doing something bad for kids by doing this? It could make some kids feel embarrassed or reticent or more shy. And people often ask about that. I haven't actually found that to be the case, partly because one way to present it to them is to say to them, people, you know, other teachers also want to learn, are also working on their teaching just like I am, or even just saying to them, you do such interesting mathematical thinking that other people wanted to see some of the work that we've been doing, which then makes them feel not so much focused on the observers, but feeling like they're not here to like judge me if I say something wrong, but they're just interested and they feel sort of proud. But you may have to think about that a little, because it would be normal to be nervous about people being there. So it might be important to explain to them why this is happening. I think like it's helped to be more explicit by being aware that other people won't know what's in my head, by having to say, be more explicit with the students, has also, with the observers, has helped me be more explicit with my own students. So it like has developed my ability to say, like, right now, are you able to hear what Mamadou just said? Is being explicit with them in a way that I might not have always done. I think I've already said it, it helps to augment the goal of having everybody speak loudly enough, because you kind of have to have them speak loudly, but that's a good idea anyway. And I think that it does convey to the students that teaching is really a serious practice, that we take it really seriously, that other teachers are also thinking hard about how to see kids thinking and to help them learn, and that they're doing something themselves that other teachers are also trying to do with their students. It doesn't have to be like, I'm a great teacher and other people are coming to see me. It doesn't have to be like, you guys are so special, but we are all together, like you said, what you said, we're all trying to figure out how to really tune into our students. And so we're working together to see what kinds of things we all do. And that seriousness is something even very young children have found, like, have been sort of excited about and have told families, like, you know, this was important. I think there's some real challenges to doing this. I'm sure you can think of even more than I've listed on the slide. It's really easy because of the culture that we live in as teachers to get it. It's really easy to equate it with model practice. I feel like I have to always oversay over and over again. I'm not saying that what I'm doing here like is the right thing to do, or that this lesson you're going to see is going to go well. Things come up. They come up in all of our classrooms, and it's almost better that if something comes up that this is not very good at all, just to help make that point. It is about making the real work visible and not like what some people call a Sunday school lesson. I don't know if that's where that came from, but like, it's not, the goal isn't to like do everything perfectly. It's actually to make things that we almost are afraid to talk to each other about that are really hard, make those visible and work on them. So, but it's hard to get away from that, because if you're an experienced teacher and you do this, people come with that mindset. So you may have to do quite a bit to undo that, in your own head, but also in how you speak to your colleagues about it. I think this is the point you were making at the beginning. There's a conflation problem of the teacher with the public teaching. One norm that we developed that I think I have second thoughts about now, but that often in the elementary math lab, we developed a habit of talking about the teacher. I think somebody here actually talked about it that way too, rather than talking about the person by name, but I don't think that's necessarily the point at all. It does help to focus on the teaching, but you just have to think about what are ways to get away from the whole, I liked what so-and-so just did, or I liked what you just did, so that it's not second person and it's not by name, but it's really about the work. It can include things that are special about that person's and what they're doing, but it's about the doing. So that just takes a bit of work, because we live in a teaching culture that isn't like that. I guess I've already said this, it's about making your teaching visible. It's not about doing everything right. And getting over feeling like embarrassed or bad if something comes up that you regret. It happens in every single lesson. I don't like my tone of voice, the way I talked to Dovan on that video, and I've showed that video like hundreds of times to colleagues by now. I think I'm kind of sharp with him on that video, like, no, stop. Like, there probably are different ways I could have gotten him to not go that far or to pause or to think about what he was doing. I don't think that was that great. And there were a couple other things on that video that I would think differently about. And so I think just realizing like that is part of the work, and being more open about that is important. And that just, I think I've tried to illustrate, there's a lot of levels of attention and purpose that are not like just a regular day. And it takes some consciousness and practice to get to feeling comfortable doing that. It's a lot of fun, but it's not, it's more work, I guess I would say. It's not just like being willing to have people come in. So I have a few conclusions from trying to work on this for a long time. One is public teaching does require some practices that are beyond what we all do just as teachers. And some of them we're talking about. It seems like the practices that help public teaching to be worthwhile are also good for the kids, which was kind of a surprise to me to see how many of the things that I found myself doing were actually useful for my students as well. And we've talked about some of those. I think we've got to figure out as a profession how to make public teaching and the practices involved in it, like in ways to learn it, more available, like to honor that that's important work that we could learn from. It's not expensive. It's a really good source of learning, but we shouldn't take for granted that someone who's, let's say, we often talk about master teachers. I don't consider myself one, but we do have people in districts who are called that just being a very experienced teacher doesn't mean you'll be good at public teaching. In fact, it might be harder, because if you've invested in having an identity that you're a master teacher, it might be all the harder to be willing to just do regular teaching, and whatever comes up is available for everyone to talk about. So letting go of that identity is helpful. And I guess what I mean by that is it's not that you should start thinking you're a bad teacher, but what I feel like I'm good at is I'm good at learning teaching, and I'm good at thinking about my teaching. That's different than saying I'm good at everything I do as a teacher. I think that's what you have to embrace, is that you like making your teaching available, you like thinking about teaching, but that you're not fussed if something goes wrong, and that becomes something you work on with colleagues, because that will happen. Like, that's normal. So just my postscript is I put a bunch of things from this session into a folder, into the folder that you have access to. I put this PowerPoint. I put, starting from the bottom, I gave an example of a public teaching lesson plan, like I showed a little bit of that on the slides. I gave the video transcript for this video clip. I gave you the video. And where it says PD tasks, that's just in case you ever would like to use this problem in a professional development context. There are a bunch of different things you can do with that rectangle problem in a PD setting. That's sort of a little different than the public teaching point, although I guess it could be used as part of that. But I just thought, now that you've seen that video 3 times, you might be interested in seeing some things that could be done with that problem. And if you want the longer clip, just let me know. I just made a very short clip because I knew I was going to show it 3 times, but if you want like more of the clip, I can share that with you too, and I can just put it in there. I would just ask that you not give the video to other people without letting me know. So I think I'm going to stop with that. We have a few minutes for you to, tell me what you're thinking, what you think could, what cautions you would say, what you see as potential to be developed, thoughts you have that would be really interesting and useful to me. So we'll just open it up. You want to turn and talk first? Why don't you turn and talk and see if there's some suggestions that would be good to bring up. See, I can learn. All right, let's come back together. What thoughts do you have about the idea of public teaching, about specific practices or ways of thinking about it that you might think differently about or that you want to lift up and comment on? Because part of the goal here is like to spread this a bit more so more people are like thinking about what it would look like to do it.
We had a couple questions.
You do?
We had a couple.
Okay.
What kind of norms might you set for your observers as they enter your space to observe your public teaching?
One question I forgot to mention is that I found that it's important to say to my colleagues if they're watching that they need to like have their faces be pretty impassive. Like we enjoy children, many of us, and so when a child says something it happened here yesterday when we were seeing videos. We see a child say something that's unexpected. We think it's a little bit funny, or maybe we think something's wrong. It's hard to keep control of one's face, but the kids do notice that. And so I've asked people to try really hard to think about just managing how you look, which is not that easy. But I think once people are aware of it, they can try, and also not to be talking to somebody nearby. At the elementary math lab, we actually have another room where we're streaming for people who can't do that. It's not like we send them there, but we like, if you really can't like not laugh when kids talk and you can't avoid talking to your neighbor, then probably you should watch it streaming. But that doesn't really apply to what we're talking about. But I think it would help to have people recognize like the respect they need to show to the children by not appearing to have a reaction, which isn't natural. That's one. And I think the other is to develop some norms around what the debriefing looks like. It can be helpful to have somebody else lead the debriefing, like another colleague could lead it and could say to Meg, like, Meg, do you want to make a few comments? What came up today that you were hoping? What came up that you had not expected? Is there a question on your mind that you'd really like to hear people talk about? You can ask the person who is doing the teaching to do that and then just let that person relax. They've just finished teaching. Or if it's you, you get to relax and just listen to your colleagues talk and someone else can manage the discussion. That could be really helpful. And if the debrief can't happen right away, it needs to happen like after school or at a different time, still that same thing would apply. I think the hardest thing is to get people comfortable with moving away from saying what they liked and didn't like. Not that that's not nice to hear, but that's really not the purpose, and it's so hard to stop it. We were just used to doing that, and we also want to say nice things to each other when this isn't really about that. It's not about criticizing each other, but it's not really about like complimenting either. It's just literally about, like you said at the beginning, thinking hard together about the things we all deal with, but we deal with them by ourselves a lot.
Another question our table had was, what might this look like sustained over time?
Like the same classroom or?
So say this was your first video doing public teaching. What could the next time look like? Would the same teacher do it? Would you, have a small group of teachers trying it out with each other?
Yeah, I think those are all things that would be interesting for you to think through. Like in a building, might there be a few people who in a school year want to do that and other people want to learn how to be the observers? Because everyone has a role in this. It's not just the person doing the teaching. It could be one person who's willing to be the person doing it for a while till other people decide they'll do it. But that doesn't make that person in charge of it. It's just, that's still collective work. So I think I don't have a good answer for that. In the case where I've been working for a very long time, I was the person doing the teaching. But that doesn't mean that I was better at it or anything else. I think those are things you could just decide. But the main thing I would say is it's not just about being willing, though. It's being willing to actually think about the work that goes into doing it, not just being willing to let people watch you, because that's a different thing. It's just not quite the same thing.
So I'm wondering about there possibly being a process prior to engaging staff in like the full making teaching public experience, because I know that I wrote down that you wrote, this is about exploring the study of the teaching practice. And I did hear you say also, though, that teaching is personal. And I would say that in the building that I'm in, we have a lot of teachers who take a lot of pride in the work that they do and the time that they put into it. And it is so personal to them. So what might be something that we could do leading up to like the full experience? And wondering if might that be using public teaching that isn't our staff first to explore the process, or if you have other ideas.
That's such a great question. Oh, I think I
I'm
have
sorry,
a
I
mic.
keep handing it to you.
That's a really, really nice question to think about developing that both the culture in a building, but also different people doing it. I think that's really a really great question. I think it could work to have an opportunity to go through the cycle or do it even once with somebody who's not one of the people in the building, which would make it possible to sort of look at the whole practice, think about it, and that person could be sort of exhibit, like some of the things you're saying could be hard. Because I agree, I think for people who are likely to be willing to do this, they are also very invested in their work, and it's not that easy to just say, like, this isn't about, my proving myself, it's really about being willing to make my practice available. So you could simulate it with a video, but this is somewhat imperfect, so you could do that though. You could definitely kind of simulate a whole cycle with a video. But it might be good to have someone else doing the public teaching so that even after you go through one example of it, people can ask, like, what did that feel like and what did you do, and actually talk to the person live. We just didn't have the capacity to do that here. But I love that you're thinking about that, and I think you're right that it isn't something you would just leap into, at least in a lot of contexts, and I think those are really good ideas. Watching video could be a step, but I do think that there could be value in just having an example that's from outside. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I think it was on the previous slide. There was a bullet point that said this is not about best practices, it's rather about the practice of teaching. Yes.
Oh, that one.
Yes, number one. So can you elaborate on that, I guess, because making teaching public feels to me like the very first thing I think of is it's modeling best practice. Or maybe it's just the pursuit of that.
Oh. So what we're doing together as a collective is trying to make our practice really good. But any given case isn't promising to portray best practice, just because of the realities of like what comes up, right? So we see things here all the time where we're going to have kids talk about their thinking, but we've all been in classrooms where getting 25 or 30 little people to do that is really hard work, and things come up. And so the value of that is it doesn't have to be perfect. It's more like making things that we all deal with, like acknowledging that we all work on those things and that they're hard. And often the idealized things we see in other contexts don't admit like that work. So I think it's making space for that work. But I think you don't want public teaching. I don't mean to be like make it sound like you don't want somebody who screams at kids all the time doing public teaching. That's not the goal. But it should be normal, very well-intentioned, hardworking teaching where things go wrong and go well, both. Does that make sense? Well, thank you so much for coming. I was worried nobody was going to come to the session, so thank you for coming. And the stuff is in the folder that's available to you. And if there's either you can't open something, let me know, or if you want something else, let me know as well. We have also lots of videos that I'm happy to share if you want them for any purpose. I won't be here this afternoon, but I will be back tomorrow morning. So thank you again. Thanks a lot for coming.
Into the kitchen floors are wet.